For more than 20 years, no one can prove this animal was still alive. And when scientists finally got photographs of one, they realized there's still some really big questions about it. And I'm here to answer as many of those questions as I can, because together we're making the anonymous animals known. This is a Cozumel fox. Yes, it's a fox. It's related to the gray fox, but it is much smaller. And that little difference actually tells us something really fascinating about evolution. The Cozumel fox is found only on Cozumel Island, off the coast of Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. And when I say only on Cozumel, I mean this animal's entire world is an island. Thousands of years ago, the ancestors of these foxes became isolated from their mainland relatives, and they stayed isolated for thousands of years. Research suggests that isolation began somewhere between about 5,000 and 37,000 years ago. So what happens to a population of animals separated on an island for that long? Well, they get smaller. This is called insular dwarfism. Insular basically means island, and insular dwarfism is when an island population becomes smaller than its mainland relatives over many generations. But I want to make something clear. This isn't one fox moving on an island and suddenly shrinking. We're talking about an entire population changing over a very, very long period of time. An island is a different environment from the mainland. There are different habitats, different resources, and much more limited area to live in. So over a long period of time, those differences can affect how a population changes, and the Cozumel fox appears to be one of those examples. Researchers have found what's called subfossil remains. Think really old bones that aren't quite fossils yet. Those remains show a 60 to 80% reduction in body size compared to mainland foxes. So we're not talking about a normal gray fox that just looks a little smaller. We're talking about an island population that becomes noticeably different from its mainland relatives. Cozumel actually has other examples of this. The island is home to the pygmy raccoon and the dwarf coati, which are smaller relatives of mainland animals. So this fox is part of a much bigger story about what happens to animals when they're isolated on an island for thousands of years. So here's where we get into something we still don't have answers to. We don't actually know everything about what this population is. Right now, it's referred to as Eurasian sp. Eurasian is the genus that includes the gray fox and the island fox, but the Cozumel fox hasn't been formally described as its own species. And that's important because we have a population of foxes that has been isolated for thousands of years and has a dramatically different body size from a mainland fox. And it may even have its own genetic differences, but scientists still need more information to determine exactly how distinct it is. So right now, we're just calling it the Cozumel fox, and that's it. It doesn't have its own scientific species name yet. That's one of the reasons the research happening right now matters so much. The last reported sighting before 2023 was in 2001. And after that, there were no confirmed photographic records for more than 2 decades. The only physical evidence we had of these foxes on Cozumel are some really old remains. So for years, there were some really big questions. Was this fox even still here? But on September 14, 2023, reports started coming in about a disoriented fox near Cozumel's coastal highway. At about 6 a.m, Rafael Chacon found an adult male fox near kilometer 29 of the coastal highway, and he got these photographs. The first photograph ever taken of the species on the island and the first reported sighting since 2001. And this fox was safely recovered and held under observation. Then 3 days later, on September 17th, he was released into the Laguna Columbia State Reserve after a physical assessment. And the research documenting that encounter was published on May 4th, 2026. So we're not talking about some animal that scientists figured out 100 years ago. We're learning about this fox right now. So how many are left? This is one of the biggest questions. And right now, we don't have an answer. There isn't a specific population survey that tells us exactly how many Cozumel foxes are left on the island. We don't have a complete picture of where they even occur. And we still need genetic and physical information to understand this animal. It also doesn't currently have a formal species description or an IUCN Red List assessment. And that part is just so crazy to me. I love checking the IUCN Red List when I'm researching animals. It's one of the first places I go when I want to see how a species is doing. So when I find an animal that doesn't have a formal assessment yet, I'm like, how do we not know this? And in this case, there's a reason. You can't do a population survey if you don't know where the animals are. You can't figure out their population size if you can barely find them, and you can't fully understand what makes them unique without the genetic and physical information to back it up. But that's the part the researchers are working on right now. And because it's found only on one island, everything happening on that island matters. So Pathos Wildlife identifies concerns including habitat fragmentation, development, invasive and introduced species, hurricanes, and vehicle collisions. And the coastal highway is especially important. It loops around Cozumel and crosses areas where wildlife moves between different habitats. For a fox that's already incredibly difficult to find, roads can make things even harder. And there's another problem with the roads that I think a lot of people don't think about. When you're talking about an animal that may already be extremely rare and only exist on one island, every individual matters. So this is where Pathos Wildlife comes in. Pathos is a volunteer-run nonprofit working to understand and protect wildlife through science, technology, advocacy, and storytelling. And right now, they're working to answer some really basic questions about this fox. How many are left? Where are they? What habitat do they need? Where do they move? What are they doing at different times of the day? What threats are they running into? And what can we actually change? Because before you can make a conservation plan for an animal, you need to know what you're trying to protect. And earlier this year, the team deployed 84 trail cameras across southern Cozumel. And these aren't cameras where somebody is sitting there watching a screen all day waiting for a fox to walk by. They're motion activated. They can sit out there day and night and record animals as they move through the forest without researchers having to be standing there. And that matters for an animal like this. A fox could walk through an area at 3 a.m. and nobody would ever know it was there unless a camera catches it. But even if the camera doesn't catch a fox, that information is still really useful. Researchers can start figuring out where foxes are showing up, where they're not showing up, what habitats they're using, when they're active, and what other animals are using those same areas. So over time, all these cameras can start putting together a picture of what is actually happening across an entire island. And the team at Pathos has now completed its second field season and is analyzing the footage and data. And here's one of my favorite parts of this project, because if you need DNA from an animal that you can barely find, how do you get the DNA? You don't necessarily have to catch the fox. You can let the fox collect the sample for you. Pathos is using small adhesive hair traps near camera stations where foxes are likely to pass. So if a fox walks by and brushes against one, it can leave behind a few strands of fur, and those hairs contain DNA. So this fox doesn't have to be captured. The researchers don't have to chase it through the forest. They can collect a sample that the animal naturally left behind. And then, of course, they analyze the DNA, which tells us who is this fox, which foxes are related, how much genetic diversity is in the population, and how genetically different is the population from other foxes, which is especially important for the Cozumel fox. Okay, remember, we're still trying to figure out exactly what this animal is. Pathos is using advanced DNA sequencing to compare the Cozumel fox genetic information with closely related fox populations. This helps researchers identify unique genetic differences and understand the fox's history. It could also provide some of the information needed to formally describe the Cozumel fox as its own distinct species. Meaning this little piece of fur could potentially help answer a question we've had for years. What exactly is the Cozumel fox? This fox is also largely active at night and during the low light hours around dawn and dusk. And Cozumel has dense vegetation, so trying to find a tiny fox by walking around looking for it is not exactly easy. Thermal drones are giving researchers another option. A thermal camera can detect heat. So instead of relying only on being able to actually see a fox through all that vegetation, researchers can look for heat signatures from above. And these drones can cover large areas that would be extremely difficult to search for on foot. And if researchers find something that looks like a fox, they can follow up with cameras and genetic sampling. So they're not, which is great because they're not just relying on one method. They're putting all of the pieces together. Cameras, DNA, thermal imaging, field observations. All of that information can help answer a much bigger question. Is this fox still hanging on across Cozumel, and what does it need to survive? I think sometimes we talk about conservation like somebody just needs to find an endangered animal and save it. But sometimes the first step is figuring out what is actually happening. Where is the animal? How many are there? Where does it go? What does it eat? What habitat does it use? What's killing it? What happens when we encounter a road? How much genetic diversity is left? And what makes this population different from the animal it's evolved from? Which are all questions Pathos is trying to answer. Once they have those answers, they can start making better decisions about what needs to be protected, where animals are moving, where roads are a problem, and what areas are most important. That's conservation. It's not always a dramatic rescue. Sometimes it's 84 cameras sitting in the forest. Sometimes it's a few hairs stuck to a little trap. Sometimes it's flying a thermal drone over a forest at night. And sometimes it's a scientist trying to figure out whether an animal nobody has seen in decades is even still out there. The Cozumel fox has been isolated on this island for thousands of years. It has evolved separately from its mainland relatives. It's physically different. It may even be genetically different, and we are still learning exactly what makes it so unique. But the entire population exists on one island, so protecting the Cozumel fox isn't just about saving a fox. It's about protecting the island it depends on. And of course, the other animals that live there and the habitats they all share. Because when an animal only exists in one place, it doesn't always get a second chance somewhere else, unless people step in and help. And that's exactly why I wanted to do this series. Anonymous Animals is where I introduce you to animals you've probably never heard of, but I wanted to take some of those animals and go deeper. Because once you know the animal, I also want you to understand what's happening to it. I want you to know what scientists are still trying to figure out. I want you to know who's actually doing something about it. And I want you to know that conservation isn't always some giant famous animal that everybody already knows. Sometimes it's a tiny fox on an island that almost disappeared without most of us ever even knowing it existed. And I think that's worth knowing because you can't care about an animal you've never heard of, and you can't protect something you don't understand. So how can we help? Pathos Wildlife is actively working on the Cozumel fox, and I'll put their Cozumel Fox Project below this video so you can see what they're doing, what they're learning, and how you can support their work. I'm also going to link my original anonymous animal video about the Cozumel fox. That's where we first met this little guy. If you know somebody who thinks they know every animal, send them this, because I want to know how many people had actually heard of the Cozumel fox before today. Did you?